I have two more chapters left of The Diamond in the Window by Jane Langton. And this chapter is called The Crystal Sphere. And here is the picture. Okay. But the dream was charming. Prince Krishna was there, looking gigantic and blowing bubbles. Giant bubbles, great, shining, wobbling balloons of bubbles big as houses, drifting and floating around in the moonlight. Eddie was there before her. He ran ahead of Eleanor, laughing, and tried to stand under a big bubble as it fell. The bubble billowed and wallowed around him, and there he was inside. Miraculously, the filmy walls surrounded him and lifted him up to float buoyantly to and fro. Eleanor found a bubble for herself, and she too had a ride. It was delicious, soft, gently wafting from the floor to the ceiling, bobbing against it with a yielding bounce and drifting delightfully to the floor again. Eleanor's bubble grazed Eddie's and joined it. There was a flat wall of soapy film between them. Their bubbles swayed along together for a while, and then came to rest on the floor. Both bubbles burst in a shower of suds, and Eleanor and Eddie ran to board other bubbles. Prince Krishna's dim, kindly face smiled far above them, and he blew foaming clouds of bubbles big and small. Eleanor and Edward played among them, batting at them and blowing them, and pelting each other with them. Then they floated around in them again. It wasn't until Eleanor was nodding along high above the floor in her sixth bubble that she noticed something strange. The wall of the bubble seemed less elastic and yielding than the others had been. She pushed her fist into it and found that it resisted her pressure, giving way only slightly. The film was hardening. Its perfect transparency was milking over, and an oily slick of rainbow color had appeared on the outside. The bubble drifted to the floor, and Eleanor punched her way out. It burst with a rubbery snap. She was immediately engulfed by another. Its walls, too, were thickening. It carried her off, and she beat her fists against it. Where was Eddie? Eleanor looked around wildly through the distorting curved walls of her bubble. There he was, looking up doubtfully as a bubble plopped around him. It bounded off the floor and sailed swiftly past. Eleanor kicked her way out of her bubble, which was a few inches above the floor, and dropped heavily and painfully on her side. Then she picked herself up and ran around looking for Edward's bubble. Bubbles were beginning to collide with one another with some force and rebound away again with a hard noise like the clack of ricocheting billiard balls. Eleanor was knocked down by one just as Eddie's bubble hit the floor again, and she missed her chance. His bubble shot away. The one that had knocked her down was bigger than most of the others, and just for a minute she thought she had mistaken. Wasn't this Eddie's bubble and not the other one? There was someone in it. But then she saw that there were two white faces pressed against the curving wall. The surface was beginning to mist over, but she could see them clearly. It was Ned and Nora. They, too, had been captured by a bubble. Would they be able to get out of it? But she must help Eddie first. His bubble was floating down again. Eleanor darted around under it and made a rush at it and caught it. She kicked it in, and Eddie fell out. His prison shrank into nothingness with a horrid, flabby report like a backfire. They picked themselves up and looked around. The sound of the collisions had become higher in pitch. Now it was the shrill, deafening sound of glass crashing against glass as the thickening walls hardened still further and crystallized. Eleanor and Edward were surrounded by smashing, splintering cannonballs. They ran. And as they ran, Eleanor thought with a sinking heart how wrong she had been about Prince Krishna. It was he, after all, who had made the pretty dreams go bad. Hadn't she seen him blowing the bubbles himself? She looked back at the source of the bubbles, the big white bubble pipe, and saw it through the rainbow walls of another colossal bubble which was falling right over her. The bubble enveloped her with a loud pop and carried her off. But for a moment, Eleanor forgot to fight against it. She continued to look upward. Prince Krishna was not blowing the bubbles. Not anymore. There was another face. There, a huge jack-in-the-box face, dim and shadowy and distorted, but unmistakable. And of course, it couldn't be Prince Krishna because he was down there on the floor, looking very small. Eleanor began to kick at the glassy wall. Prince Krishna was looking around helplessly, fending off a boiling, shattering barrage of bubbles. Eleanor kicked and thumped. She must get out to reach him. Then, to her despair, she saw him look up in surprise as a heavy bubble encased him and lifted him off the floor. She knelt against her curving bubble wall and craned her neck to look after him. She mustn't lose sight of him. This she knew was what happened to him. This was how he had been caught, and Ned and Nora too. Prince Krishna's bubble shot up higher. It was milking over. Suddenly it collided with another, and the two collapsed into a single huge sphere. Swiftly the surface clouded, but for a second Eleanor could see Nora's white dress and the larger shape that was Ned, and they were there too. Their bubbles had joined into one. Eleanor watched, drumming her fists against her own bubble wall, as the bubble imprisoning Prince Krishna and the lost children underwent a process of locking and sealing. One by one, other bubbles approached it and snapped around it until there were bubbles within bubbles within bubbles, spheres within spheres. With each encompassing bubble, the surface became more opaque until the outer one at last was a sleek and shining silver globe. Eleanor recognized it. How could she fail to? She knew it so well. It was the gazing globe that had stood so quietly all these years, reflecting the outdoors in their own front yard. The crystal sphere was to have been the treasure that had become a prison. Eleanor sprang at the wall of her bubble, hurling the whole weight of her body against it. It burst with a boom like the sound of river ice splitting and cracking, and she was free, falling and falling out of her bubble and out of her dream, and waking up sore and unhappy in her own bed. Instantly awake, she sat up with a terrible question. Where was Eddie? She twisted herself around to look at her brother's bed. It was empty. Eddie was gone. Eleanor leaped up and ran downstairs, half falling down the ladder steps. The door of Eddie's bedroom was open. She ran inside. That bed, too, was empty. Her heart thumping and drumming, Eleanor scrambled all over the house, searching in the dark and calling in a trembling whisper for her brother. But she knew well enough where Eddie was. He, too, had been caught in the dream, caught like the lost children, caught like Prince Krishna. The game had proved too dangerous after all. Eddie was lost. The game was lost. Hoping against hope, Eleanor stumbled around again in Eddie's room. She felt under his bed and poked in his closet. Then the sight of his dresser top with its orderly arrangement of matchboxes, pennies, and bottle caps brought her little brother so sharply before her mind that she burst into tears. Blindly she ran out of the room and up the attic stairs. Tripping and stumbling, she made her way up the ladder and looked around the little room. It was empty. Eleanor ran to the window and stared up at the diamond. Their troubles would never have begun. They hadn't found the writing on the window. Eleanor banged at the glass with her fist and kicked it with her furry slipper. It's your fault, you horrible window. Why did we ever have anything to do with you? She wasn't kicking hard enough to break the glass, but she jarred the metal frames that held the pieces of the colored glass together, and all at once one of the pieces came loose and fell at Eleanor's feet. It was the diamond. She reached down and picked it up. It was so big it half filled the palm of her hand. It lay there glistening. It seemed to fill with light as though it had gathered itself into itself glints from all of the dimly lighted surfaces in the room and focused and magnified them within itself. And there was something on the back of it, something that had been fastened to the other side of the diamond, the out-of-door side which she had never seen, except from far away down on the ground. It was a small metal hoop. It made the diamond look like a finger ring. Eleanor slipped it over the middle finger of her right hand and looked at it. Then she turned swiftly and stared at the disordered blankets on her bed. There was only one thing to do. She must get back in the bubble dream. It was the only hope of finding and saving Eddie, and she might be caught in it herself if she couldn't rescue him, for how could she face Aunt Lily and Uncle Freddie without him? It was all or nothing. Grimly, Eleanor lay down flat on her back and stared at the ceiling. Hurry, hurry. But how could she hurry into sleep? Relax, be calm. Eleanor wrenched herself around in the bed and lay on her side. How could she be calm? She found herself staring wide-eyed into the dark, and she shut her eyes fiercely. Then she found that she was playing a nervous tune, using her upper teeth against her lower teeth like fingers on piano keys, playing the same rapid phrase over and over. Dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee. She stopped doing that and tried stiffening out all over and then relaxing, toe by toe, joint by joint. How long was it before Eleanor at last went to sleep? Not as long as she thought. She was thoroughly exhausted, and by the time she had relaxed all her toes one by one, and the arch of her left foot and her right, and her ankles, left and right slowly, and her left shin and her right very slowly, and her right knee, and Eleanor was sound asleep and groping her way back into the dream. But the dream had become chaos. It was a nightmare of glassy balls, crashing and colliding with sharp, smiting, shuddering sounds. The metallic, reverberating noise was frightful. Eleanor stood in her nightgown, looking around fearfully with her arms over her head. She sprang to one side to avoid the recoil of two balls which smashed just above her. Oh, where was Eddie's bubble? Then she saw it spinning by. Eddie was looking out at her and calling something, but she couldn't hear. And there beyond him was the great silver sphere that contained Prince Krishna and the two lost children. Watch out, here came a giant bubble. It was going to descend all around her and close her in. Eleanor reached out her hands to fend it off. Suddenly, as it touched her hand, it shattered into 1,000 pieces. What had happened? Then she saw where her strength lay. It was in her ring. She held her right hand up again. The ring made it heavy, so she encircled her right wrist with her left hand, doubled her right hand into a fist, ducked her head, and flailed about her with the great stone. There was a shattering, shivering, and sundering noise as though all the window glass and the crystal dinner plates and goblets in the world were being exploded into fragments at one time. The noise went grinding and crashing on. Eleanor kept her eyes clenched shut and her chin down on her chest and flung her arms around above her head, battering and slashing at the bubbles. At last the noise stopped, and she found herself tilting at nothing. Slowly, she lifted her head and opened her eyes and brought her arms down. The bubbles were gone. They had shattered, every last one of them, into soapy rings on the floor, and there was Eddie standing next to her. Prince Krishna and Ned and Nora were gone, but there was something else there. It was the Jack-in-the-Box. They stood face to face with the enemy at last. Eleanor and Edward turned together and looked at him. No longer was he only a face, seemed vaguely through the shimmering sides of a bubble, nor an apparition in the mirror, nor a resemblance traced in the clumsy features of a snowman or the sharp beak of a bird of prey, nor was he even a grim toy with a giant spring in a box. He was a man in a turban. He spoke to Eleanor. "Give me the diamond," he said. Eleanor put her hands behind her back. She tried to speak but couldn't. She shook her head. Then the man made a swift motion at his side. He was holding something now, something that glittered in a curving shaft 3 feet long. It was a long knife, or a kind of sword. "Give me the diamond," he said again. Eleanor said nothing, but she gripped the hand that wore the diamond with her other hand behind her back and looked doubtfully at Edward. What should she do? Eddie was looking at the sword. He wondered why he didn't feel more afraid. The live enemy was just as ugly as the jack-in-the-box had been, but he was made of flesh and blood, and that meant you could trip him and he would fall, you could hurt him and he would cry out in pain. Eddie felt a surprising surge of courage. He stepped behind Eleanor. "Evig t ot m," he said. "What?" said Eleanor, looking blankly at him. "Eam, evig t ot m," he said. "Oh." He's talking backwards, and he's saying, "Give it to him." "Oh," said Eleanor. She looked back at the man and twisted her fingers nervously. The ring slipped off her finger, and she passed it to Eddie behind her back. Actually, in backwards English, he was saying, "Give it to me." Eddie was telling her to give him the ring. Okay. Eddie put it on. Then the man who had been the jack-in-the-box lifted his sword over his head threateningly and advanced a step towards Eleanor. But Eddie had a weapon too. His jackknife was in his pocket. He took it out and snapped out the longest blade. Then he jumped jauntily in front of Eleanor in his bare feet and his wrinkled pajamas. Impudently, he flourished his 3-inch blade at the long, terrible sword. Tauntingly, he stuck out the small hand that had the big diamond on it. "Try and get it," he said, hopping around on 2 feet at once in what he thought was a professional fencing style. "I double dare you." But the man with the sword stood menacingly still. He had no need for subtle footwork or for graceful parries and lunges. He needed only main strength and a long arm. And those he had. He was a grown man. Eddie was only a boy, and small for his age at that. The man towered over him. Then he lifted his sword high over his head and held it there with the flat side down and started to walk heavily toward Eddie. Eleanor fell back with her hands over her mouth. Why did her mind work so foolishly? At a time like this, it was making a little joke. 2 jacks, it says, jackknife and a jack-in-the-box. And if Eddie loses the fight, we'll have to have a funeral, and then there'll be another jack, a jack in the pulpit. Eleanor found herself laughing hysterically. Oh, it wasn't funny at all. Slash! Down came the terrible sword. But Eddie's clever bouncing hops took him out of the way just in time. He danced away, then pranced back, waving his miniature sword. Trevor Nosenboard seemed to enjoy this kind of thing. Eddie felt strong and fit, nimble and quick. He could hop back and forth in this swashbuckling way forever, and dodge and parry with one hand tied behind his back. Again the man used the flat side of the sword, but this time he swung it from behind and brought it around his body in a whirling level arc. Again Eddie jumped back neatly, and the long blade whistled on the ground. It carried the man around with it, and for a moment Eddie had the advantage. He dashed forward, meaning to get within working range for his little knife. But wet soap suds on the floor betrayed him, and Eddie lost his balance and fell down. Now the advantage was the other way around. Eddie had landed face down. He rolled over and lay on his back. Over him, looking miles high, was the man in the turban, and over his head the sword was lifted high. Eddie winced and stared at it, but the man just held it there. He spoke hoarsely, his chest heaving. "Now you will give it to me," he said. "Go ahead, Eddie," cried Eleanor, running forward. "Give it to him." She grabbed at Eddie's finger and tried to pull the ring off. He snatched his hand away. Then the man in the turban dropped to his knees and knelt heavily on Eddie's chest. He pinned down Eddie's arms and snarled at Eleanor. "Take it off," he said. Eleanor gave him a frightened glance. She reached timidly for Eddie's hand and tried to pull the ring off his finger. It wouldn't come. She tugged at it with all of her might, but she couldn't budge it. She looked up apologetically at the awful face that was so near to hers. "I'm sorry," she said, I can't get it off." The man in the turban became savage. He jumped up with a roar and dragged the two children to their feet. Then he snatched Eleanor, and with dreadful strength, he held her two arms behind her back with one hand and pointed his sword at her with the other. He shouted at Eddie, "Give me the diamond." Eleanor struggled with him, kicking out with her feet and wrenching her captive arms from side to side, but he held her fast, and now he had the point of his long knife at her neck. She could feel it making a sharp dent in her throat. For the first time, Eddie was frightened. He forgot to be Trevor Nosembor. He forgot to be a fencing expert. It was all very well to shout double dares, but what should he do now? The man in the turban was holding Eleanor up off the floor by her pigtail. It hurt her like anything, but at least she had her hands free. She used them to beat and scratch at the arm that was holding her as she lashed out at the same time with her legs. Hesitantly, Eddie held the blade of his jackknife over his shoulder in a throwing position. If only Eleanor would stop wiggling, then he could aim. He shouted at her, "Eleanor, hold still." Eleanor heard him and went limp. In an instant, she changed from a kicking, scratching, clawing animal into a dead weight. The man was caught off guard. He fell forward, entangled in his own long sword and Eleanor's sprawling legs. Eleanor sat down on the floor with a heavy bump. There was a harsh cry. Eddie saw his chance. The advantage was his again. His enemy lay on the floor. Now was the time to finish him off. He adjusted his blade between two of his fingers in the grip that gave him the surest aim, the one that sent the knife to the mark every time, point down. But he didn't throw it. Something stopped him. He waited for the man to turn over and get to his feet, so that the odds would be fairer, but the man didn't move. Eleanor sat on the floor where she had fallen, staring at him. Eddie waited. After a while, he moved closer and bent over, and then he stood up and folded up his jackknife. "It's all right," he said, his voice shaking a little. He fell on his sword. Eleanor put the end of her pigtail up to her eyes and cried into it. She woke up sobbing. But she stopped crying instantly and got up. She walked across to in the dark to Eddie's bed and reached out carefully to the place where his pillow was. Was Eddie's head there where it should be? "Ouch," said Eddie. "You put your finger in my eye." He sat up and shook his head. Eleanor hugged him hard. She had really, truly brought him back. Eddie pushed her away. "Listen," he said. "What's that?" The clock was striking 4, but there was another sound. It was a knocking at the front door. Last chapter tomorrow.